Okay, first of all, thank you for coming. And also, I'm just really grateful to have been given this fellowship because it's allowed me to go a lot further in my research that I would have been able to otherwise. So I wrote my dissertation on hunger and living standards and international aid in Germany during and after the First World War. And I just finished a year and a half ago, so I'm still young in my career. But I've moved into looking at what conditions were like in Vienna. And by choosing a specific city rather than an entire country, I'm able to get a lot more detailed. So I'm just gonna, maybe I'll walk around a little bit. So this is just, I just want to give an overview of my presentation so you know where I'm going. And also, just to say that a lot of the stuff that I'm doing is very interdisciplinary. But I hope that I'll present it in a way that is compelling to you and also that's understandable. So I like to use statistics. I also value equally using more standard qualitative methods. I also do some geographical mapping. So hopefully with all of this, you can come with me. And if you have questions at the end, I'm very happy to answer any of them. So just to begin with, I'm going to set the context a little bit and explain why living conditions were so terrible in Vienna during the First World War and especially afterwards. I'll also talk about the response to the crisis, the medical establishment in Vienna, which was really superb. I think it's most famous for the 19th century, but still, first part of the 20th century, this is one of the leading centers for health and specifically for childcare, which matters to the story that I'll be telling. In particular, there's this guy, Clement Paquette, an interesting character, nominated for the Nobel Prize four times, and really, I believe, helped save millions of lives, just this one individual. Then I'll talk about the data that I'm using, the mapping that I'm doing, specifically how Jewish aid falls into this, specifically about the joint, and then I'll close by talking about why I find this such an important topic today. So just to begin with, prior to the First World War, during the First World War, we have the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and just as a summary, in very simple terms, the Hungarian half of the empire was kind of like the breadbasket for the Austrian part, and certainly for Vienna. So we have a couple things that are really hurting living conditions. The first is that just as a consequence of the war, the communication, or at least the lines of trade and of grain that were being shipped from Hungary, from the Hungarian half, are no longer being shipped to Austria, in addition to war. Another big factor that negatively decreases, that negatively affects living standards in Vienna and in Austria as a whole, as well as in Turkey and Bulgaria and Germany, is the British blockade, which was initiated right at the beginning of the First World War. And the goal of this blockade was to prevent all food, as well as other material, from entering enemy territory. So you've got this two, and also, in addition to this, also there's war going on too, right? So all these three things are really affecting the amount of food that's available in Vienna and that's able to reach the city itself. I guess there's some more specifics. I'll talk a little bit more about Galicia later on, but Galicia in particular was an area that was really high in grain and in oil. As you probably know, this was occupied very early in the war. There are also a lot of Jews in Galicia who became refugees during the war, and for those that couldn't get out after the war as well. So I'm going to start. I've got a lot of pictures. So this is just a death of Vietnamese youth, so ages 15 to 20, from 1912 to 1920. We always like to separate out between males and females, just because often they'll have different, there'll be different things that are affecting their death rates, especially when you look at diseases. So what you should note, I guess, is that the death rate really increases by 1918. And certainly some of this can be explained by the flu epidemic, right? But not all of it. And that doesn't hit until 1918, but even by 1917, if you compare it to before the war, these increases are quite massive. So this is looking at total death. If we look at it by type of disease, I chose tuberculosis because tuberculosis is often related to nutritional deprivation. So these are people who died of tuberculosis And again, if you look at the key over here, 1919 to 1920, this is after the war has ended. In very many cases, you have a higher death rate, right, after the war. And this is done by age. So another thing to notice, so first, we see that there's a higher death rate after the war than before and during. And also, you can look at it by age and see that small children are highly affected as are old people. So both during and after the war, it's pretty bad news. So that was just for males, and then again we have it for females. It looks slightly different. Younger females seem to die more. There could be reasons for this, but at this point for me they're all hypotheses, but you can ask me about them later if you want. So this is just something I took from the New York Times, just talking about Vienna specifically. And just before I read this, much of the world, especially Eastern Europe, Germany was suffering deprivation after the war. People were really hungry. So the war may have officially ended. We have the armistice in November of 1918. The blockade lasts for months longer until the Treaty of Versailles is signed. And then even after it's signed, those trade routes are really slow to come forth. And so people are suffering a lot. Of all the Central European capitals I have visited in the past few weeks, Vienna is by far the hungriest. Left to its own resources, its inhabitants would literally starve to death in a week. All of its former supply of food, coal, and raw materials is cut off. Its former subject peoples, whose united resources raised it to greatness, now have ruthlessly closed their frontiers against it and will not allow an ounce of grain or a pound of coal to cross them. So this is kind of summarizing a little bit of what I was talking about. At this point, it's hard to actually know for sure if they were the hungriest or not, because hunger is something that's subjective. So when I feel hungry, I'm going to think that I'm hungrier than you are, if somebody who's in a different place. But how do we really know? That's something that I hope to, over the next few years, gather more information so I can compare. So I showed you some statistics on death rates, which isn't a really happy way to start the lecture. But now what I want to move into is talking about people who survived. So people who died, that's in some, but I'm interested in children who didn't die, but who were hungry, and how aid then affected them. So there were major responses to the crisis, in part because of reports like this. This is just one example. There was lots of information that was coming out. And the biggest one was the American Relief Administration, which was started in 1919 by Herbert Hoover. They provided about 70% of all food aid in Vienna after the First World War, and also just all over the entire world. Part of this was because of capacity. The United States had produced a massive amount of aid and of grain and also of pork that needed to be sold and needed to be used when the war ended. They'd been using it to supply the alleys, and then they had this massive amount of stuff later on. But they weren't the only ones. So you also have national organizations. So the Swiss government was heavily involved. The joint distribution, which I'll be highlighting today, was involved. And then you also have other religious groups, evangelical, Catholic, and especially Quakers. Individuals also sent aid. So, like I mentioned before, the blockade that had been enforced during the war continued for months afterwards. But once it was lifted, there were lots of, mostly Americans, but lots of family members who were then able to send gifts and parcels back over to family members in Vienna. Just two quick stories that I think are really great. One is that there was a play that was published at the time that was really popular about this rotten son who had done wrong somehow and had had to leave Vienna in shame and go off to New York. I don't know if he was Jewish or Catholic or what, but this was popular in the culture. There's this son who had been disobedient and disgraced the family and had to leave. And then the way that the play is written, there's a bunch of telegrams that go back and forth. The war ends, and suddenly his aunt and his grandma and his sister and his dad are all writing and saying, "Oh, son, all is forgotten. We love you so much. We miss you. We haven't heard from you for so long. By the way, have you heard about these care packages that you can now send to Vienna? We'd know it would be great if you could send us some." So there was still humor in the deprivation. There was also a song which I would love to find the melody for. I've been looking in different sound archives. I haven't found the actual sound recording yet, but there was a song called "Have You an Uncle in America?" Have you an uncle in America? Have him send you. Then the world is yours because you can have these care packages sent to you. And so it was really the United States that was the dominant aid giver, whether that was through the American Relief Administration or through the Joint, right? Because of the capacity. So this is a photo that I was able to get a copy of from Geneva. I was there a couple months ago doing research. And these are, so this is after the First World War, and these are schoolgirls receiving an additional meal. I think this is Schloss Belvedere, but I'm not sure. It's hard to completely tell because we don't get much of the castle. But most likely, if it's not Schloss Belvedere, it's one of the other ones that's in central Vienna. And so we have evidence this way that they were being fed. And there's also other sorts of evidence. Oh, actually, let's talk about the motivation. So I think, so for some people who study international aid, sometimes people can be a bit cynical. And there's good reason for that. Aid is not always neutral. Often there is political stuff behind it. But I think that we are mistaken to then ignore the real human motivation and reason. And certainly in the papers I've been studying, not just for Vienna, but all throughout, there are people who sincerely want to help others, and this just shines through. So there's sincere philanthropy. One way that this is used, especially at this time, is through aiming aid at children, right? So children are seen as innocent. The war is not their fault. The Kaiser is not their personal uncle or whatever else. So by using children, that's a way to kind of motivate people to give who may not have otherwise. There's also a bit of American idealism. Food was power, because food was in such demand, there was a need. And then again, as I've been saying, especially for the U.S., there was a capacity that was there that other countries didn't have and didn't share. Okay, so this is the first map I'm going to show you, and let me just let me walk through it with you. These are feeding centers set up for children across Vienna that were in operation. So this is a map of Vienna, what it looked like at this time period. So for anybody who knows Vienna now, these boundaries have changed. These individual lines, these are different Bezirke, or different districts of Vienna itself, right? So just to orient you, here in the center, that would be the first district, right? That's the ring. And then these are other districts around the city. And so what I did is I got a series of old maps and then traced these. This line is different. Also, the railroad station, if you were to look at two maps, that's another main difference between Vienna of then and today. And then each of these circles represents an individual feeding center where anywhere from a dozen to maybe thousands of meals would be served to children each day. And these are geo-referenced. So if you were to zoom in to infinity, the dot would be right there. I'm a bit proud of this map. It took me about a year to make because we've got several hundred of these little circles that are telling you exactly where the food is. And it looks nice, but it also helps with analysis. So this is the feeding centers, and this is a map that shows how many meals were served per district. So the number in each area, again, is just the number of the district. So here's the first district, the fourth, the eighth, right? I don't know how well you can see that. And so the darker the shade, the more meals were served, okay? And the lighter the shade, the less. So this also is taken from data that I've collected in archives around the world to match with each of these feeding centers. How many meals was each feeding center giving to children each day? Oh no. Okay, great. This is another map. I think in some ways using maps is a good way of explaining statistics. In this map, I've got a rank of the population in Vienna. Now I have to say, this population data is probably not perfect because there were a lot of refugees that had been coming in during the war, and especially after the war. They're coming into the capital. They're coming into Vienna. But if you rank them, more or less, this is where most of the population resided. So what I did was a few things. I ran a few correlation tests. So don't worry if you're not a statistician. Basically, Pearson's R and Spearman's rank correlation, I'm just testing to see if there's some kind of relationship between where the number of meals that were served and the population size. Do you see that? So it's a way of kind of trying to get at how thoughtful were those people who were giving aid, or what was the capacity in terms of where they were sending it. So what we find is there's not perfect correlation, but we find for Pearson's R, 0.53, for Spearman's is 0.504. It doesn't matter which one you take. If you think that the population data isn't quite right, then this would be a better one. But they're very close, and they're both highly significant. So we find that there is a relationship between size of population and the number of meals that are being fed to children. Okay, but it also is complicated because not all children in Vienna were eating at these feeding centers. Some that were very lucky, or you could say maybe very unlucky, those that were the most deprived, were often sent outside of the country on a sort of vacation where they would be fattened up. So often they'd go to Switzerland, they'd go to Sweden, they'd go to Holland, and they could go for anywhere from a few weeks to several months where they would live with a family. Sometimes they'd be sent to clinics, and they would be given new clothes and given better nutrition that they could have received in Vienna before being shipped home. So total, by the end of 1921, 200,000 children in Vienna had participated in this kinder transport of some kind. What number of these children are Jewish or not? I don't know. Just this week, I've been looking at records that suggest that, so in 1919 there was a receipt that 400 Jewish children were sent to Holland, courtesy of the joint. But the way the statistics are, I need to keep looking in order to gather all of them. I think that's a very minimum. But I know for the total that there were 200,000. So that was one way of transportation. Handing out basic supplies was another way, whether through different organizations or, like I said, maybe you'd get a package from your uncle or your renegade son from America. Maybe he'd send things back over. These two things I'm not going to analyze today. What I'm really focusing on is the massive child feeding that was occurring in Vienna. That's what I can map out. So there's a few things that's encouraging to see, and that is that people were really precise, and they targeted children who were most in need. And in order to do this, they had to be really organized. Again, like I said, if I'm hungry right now, I might assume I'm hungrier than Isaac there. But how do I know? How do we figure this out? And especially when you have so many people who are in need, it's not always a simple task. So they would measure children and assess who was in the greatest need. They put them into different categories. And those who were the worst off would receive aid first. They would be giving a feeding card, which was signed both from the school doctor or school teacher, whoever had measured them, and by the local community. And then when children went to the feeding center, they were not allowed to take any food with them. This was in part to try to prevent black market activity, and also to make sure that it reached the child itself, rather than somebody else back home or along the way who might try to take it from them. And the meal was meant to serve as a supplement, although it's not clear that it always did. Okay, so the medical establishment in Vienna has a long history of excellence. It really was a world center for research and health. One of my heroes, Ignaz Semmelweis, have any of you heard of him before? A few? Yeah, he was able, at the University of Vienna, to figure out what was causing childbed fever, which had been killing millions of mothers when they gave birth in their children. He didn't quite understand what it was, but he recognized that if he had doctors wash their hands in a chlorine-like substance, this lime-like thing, that the death rates went down. And after his death, then germ theory came about, and we were able to figure out that what he was doing was right. But anyway, but this isn't about Semmelweis. So this is only 60 years before Percot, before our story. And also, it's important to point out that the children's clinic was linked with the university. So there's a lot of research that's going on continually, okay? So here's the children's clinic at the time. Here are some of the children in the children's clinic. They look tan and happy. So let's talk about Clement Paquette. He's going to be, has anybody heard of Clement Paquette? I'd be so excited if you had. But now you'll know who he is, and he can become one of your heroes as well. He was a professor of the children's clinic in Vienna, and if he is known today, he's most well known for discovering, or at least not discovering, but explaining the concept of allergies, which is massive, right, on its own. That was in 1906. In 1909, he came up with a test for tuberculosis, a skin test, which versions of are still used today. In his lifetime, he was nominated for the Nobel Prize 4 times. He was also approached to try to run to be, so after the war, the president of Austria, which he turned down. He said he thought he could do more by working at the children's clinic to help the children than by going to politics. And what he does is he leads what are called anthropometric measurements across the Vienna after the war of all school children. And he does this by something that he calls the PolyDC. So here's a picture of Paquette. He had a tragic death in 1929, despite all of these other things he discovered, so allergies as tests for tuberculosis. At his funeral and in his obituaries, he's most loved for saving the children of Vienna. And thousands of people come out to his funeral and thank him. But since then, he's been forgotten. This PolyDC, which I'm going to introduce you to, is also forgotten. And let me just explain what it is. So talking about children and people who are hungry and looking at deprivation, how do we matter? Or how do we know what matters? Paquette came up with a system where he wanted to be able to compare children of different ages, different genders to each other, to know quickly, have a system to know who was the most deprived. This was so that they could then target aid to those who were the most needy. So today, development economists, we would use things like height for age z-scores, weight for age z-scores, but these weren't in vogue then. He's kind of thinking about comparisons about 50 years before anybody else does it. So what this is it's an index. It's a combination of measurements of height, sitting height, and weight. And he says if somebody has 100 on this index, they're fine, they're healthy. A normal child is going to be 95 or above. Issues of obesity are not a problem in 1920 Vienna, so they don't talk about going over that. It's looking for deprivation. But anybody who's less than this, that's a 95, is considered to be deprived. And the lower your score, the more deprived you are. And depending on the month and the food that's available, it's always the most deprived children who are then receiving this additional meal and the card. And some of the boundaries, they'll say, we'll feed every child with less than 93, but sometimes they don't have enough, so it goes down to 92. So that's changing a little bit, as would be expected in terms of what's available. So here's the index for those that are curious. And I think the best comparison to think about is BMI, right? And a criticism of BMI today is that humans are 3-dimensional. So if you're really tall or really short and you do the standard test for BMI, it won't quite be right. This we've got, this takes into account that people are 3-dimensional. It's weird, it's funny. I think it's usable. And if you want to talk about this with me later, please do. But it's this index which he uses to assess children. And with this, you can compare a 5-year-old to a 15-year-old to a 10-year-old. And you get this single value, and we use that to measure deprivation, okay? So Paquette, like I said, he was a big deal, nominated for the Nobel Prize. He ran the children's clinic. He has a lot of power, and he uses that power to spread the use of his PolyDC index across all of Vienna. In fact, all school children are measured, or at least they're supposed to be. So in the data that we've got, it's over 70% of all of the population of children living in Vienna between the ages 5 and 15 had their PolyDC index taken in 1920 and 1921. That's really, really big. So if you think of other studies looking at heights and weights, the sample size here, it's not even a sample. It's almost, well, it is a sample, but it's a really big sample. So it means that we can be really confident in trying to understand and look at living standards of children and being able to compare them. So just to give you a little bit about the data, 53% are males, 47% are females. 77 using his benchmarks. 77, so 94 below. 77% of children who are female are considered to be deprived after the second measurement, and 81% of males are considered to be deprived. So people are really hungry, and maybe I should have shown you some unfortunate looking pictures, but I'm not into that. But they're really hungry, and they're really deprived. And yeah, so I'll show you some more graphs in a second. One question that I had was, how does this change over time? So these children, like I said, were measured in 1920 and 1921. And they're being fed in between, okay? So a question I had is, how effective is the aid being? So the first thing that we looked at, if you remember, was where is aid going in terms of population? Where is there a relationship between the size of the population and the amount of food that's being fed? But another basic question is inequality going down? So if we know where children are the most needy, how does that change between the two measurements? Are children who are the most needy getting the most food, or are they not? So to do that, I used something called the Tiles T statistic. It's normally used looking at inequalities in income. I think using it in terms of inequality of living standards of nutritional status of living is also great. Is everybody following me so far? Some of the stuff is a little bit weird, but just move a little bit or shake your head if not, and I can explain more. What you should look at here is that this is decreasing. That's the way to think about this. So if this is the first measurement, if the next measurement was higher, that would suggest that inequality is increasing. And if it's lower, we would think that it's decreasing. This is a lot lower than this. They're both really small. I think it's because the index is so high. But this is what we would expect if the aid is being somewhat efficient. We would expect to see that inequality is decreasing between those children who are the worst off than those who are not. And this is what we find, right? So this is exciting. So let's map these PolyDC scores that I was talking about. So this is statistics, and now I'll show you in pictures, in maps. So again, these are divided by Bezirk. All of the data that I have for children who are measured, so the 70% of all school children who had their PolyDC index taken, is organized by Bezirk, which is really unique and really handy. So again, this is the first measurement. So just think of this again as deprivation. The darker the area, the more deprived. So the darker the area, the more deprived. They're all deprived, okay? If you look at it's a little bit small over here, but if you look at the legend, if you're white, you're not deprived. If the cell is white, it's not deprived. No cell is white in either place. But the lighter you go, the less deprived you are. So just looking at males, between the two measurements, you see that there's a big change, right? People are improving. You can also see there's more variation in the color tone here than there is here, right? So that's just illustrating Tiles T, so inequality is decreasing. Are you with me? Is this okay? And then let's show the same thing for females. The darker the area, the more deprived, the lighter the area. The less we see again, we see that there's a lot of improvement. So these feeding centers, the map I showed you of those that were from the ARA, they're working. Children are growing and they're improving. This is just an overall, and again you can see same patterns. Okay, so now you're all wondering, so we work for the Joint, you work for the Joint, I'm here on a fellowship by the JDC. How does Jewish aid fit into this big story of aid? Well, first of all, in 1919, we have the Joint, they go to Vienna to assess living standards. Meyer Gillis and Max Pine were sent over, and very early on they organized a committee, and it was made up of local Vietnamese people to decide how to distribute food. This is really awesome. Not everybody trusted local people. So an example is in Germany, in Leipzig, Save the Children decided they wanted to open. This is other work that I've done that will be coming out next year. They wanted to open a feeding center in Leipzig. They decided they wanted to do it, but they didn't want to hire anybody who was German or in Leipzig to distribute the food because they didn't trust them. So they sent out internal letters discussing how this was a big problem. It took them a year after they had the sources and after they had identified Leipzig to open up a feeding center, because that's how long it took them to find a Swedish woman who was living in Leipzig who could then distribute the food. And part of this, you can see, yes, they're a very recent enemy. Save the Children was started in England, but it really slows things down. So the fact that the Joint, they go to Vienna, and the whole committee is made up of local Vietnamese, speaks very well of the Joint. I think also there may be something that's beneficial, maybe the Jewish background. You're able to, there's a familiarity there that people are able to then use to their benefit. This is one of the benefits, I think, of having that. Okay, so but how else does this fit? So if you look at this map, these are all American Relief Administration feeding centers. None of these are the Joint. So I'm here to find out where the Joint ones are and where they fit in, and to try to make these statistics even better. So which children's homes, hospitals, and orphanages were supported by the Joint? How many children did they serve? And where in the city were they located? I should start just by saying briefly that I have a list, which I think is pretty good, of all the feeding centers that were operating in Vienna in 1920, 1921. And because of that, some of them I'm able to tell straight away were Jewish. So this is the Jüdische Taubstummenanstalt, the Waisenhäuser, so that's just an orphanage, and then in parentheses, it tells me that it's Israeli. These are Jewish, right? How about Jüdische Kinderheim, so the Jewish children's home, that's gonna be Jewish. Boysenhauer, another one, Jüdische. We have the Israeli Blind Institute. These are all obviously Jewish feeding centers, and I'm here to find out more information about them. So here's this bottom one that I showed before. This is the Israelitische Blind Institute, and these are pictures of people who benefited from participation there. Just to say that this was an institute that it existed well before the Joint. It existed during the war and afterwards. But the Joint then sent food or sent aid to the organization. That seems to be the way that the Joint worked at the time. So rather than setting up their own feeding centers, and probably in part because of this committee that was formed, right? So if you have local Vietnamese who are in this committee to distribute food, they're going to probably send it to places that they know and that are in need, which is another reason why it's so useful to do. I just want to zoom in on some of these people. I've been showing you a lot of statistics, and that's great, and I've been showing you maps, but I don't want you to forget that we're speaking about individuals, right? So it's individuals who are being measured, individuals who are getting food, and individuals who are benefiting. So this is just one thing from the archive. So sometimes the names themselves are not at all revealing. So those are names that are obviously Jewish. I knew they were Jewish before I came, so I've been looking for information about them. Sometimes they're not. So far, in the days that I've been here, I found that some of the ones that I didn't know were Jewish actually were, or that were supported by the Joint in any case. So there's a day nursery which is located at Ingerstrasse 79 in the 20th district, and they fed 83 children a daily meal, and this was supported by the Joint. So what I can do with this is then add it to the map and make my statistics better and see where it is going. Another example, there are children who are being fed at the Kultusgemeinde in Augarten. And this is also supported by the Joint. And I'll continue to look for these sources. How else is the Joint involved? So this is something that I'm extremely excited about. What is this? This, if you look at the top, and I actually found this, one reason I wanted to come to Jerusalem rather than New York was because I know that a lot of the records are dispersed around Jerusalem, right? So they're not all held at the Joint. They're not all held at the archive here. Some of them are spread around. So this I actually found at the Archive for the History of the Jewish People, and there was a big pile of them. And what it is it's one of these individual records that was taken to assess children's welfare, right? So I told you that 70% of all children in Vienna are measured. That's over 120,000. This is one individual student's record. Her name is Anna Fuchs. She was born in 1914. And here information, we're told her mother and her father's name, her address, where she lived. That's really useful. I don't know if I should go in the depth of mapping out all children beyond the district. I can't so far, but it's really interesting to see. And then down here we have the height, the sitting height, and the weight. These are the three components that you need for the PolyDC index, right? And then what's really exciting is this is Pirco's signature here, okay? So lots of times, I mean, he had people who were working for him, but this is one that he actually signed. So this is a piece of evidence that I hadn't seen anything like this before I came. I've just been using numbers that are in the aggregate, and this is exciting. There's about 30 of these that I found so far. I would love to find more. I don't know if I will, but this is telling us. So from this thing, I haven't done it yet, but I could then compute her individual PolyDC score and see how she was. This child was not sent to one of the vacations, the fattening up camps. I don't know. We have the opposite today. It's an interesting problem. But if she had been, then down here there would be a stamp that would say the kinder transport, and it would be signed by several people. So she's probably deprived, but not too bad. I haven't assessed it for sure. So this is something that everybody would have kept. I've been looking through archives in Vienna and Geneva and the United States, but this is the first time I've actually found an individual one. So it's quite exciting. Okay, so just to close, why does this matter? Why does it matter to be so precise? I already told you at the beginning, lots of people died. This is information about those who survived. And I think one reason is that it allows us to know what conditions actually were like. We can be much more specific. And also around the city, what were conditions like? So speaking of politics, one reason that the US, at least the American, I can't speak, the ARA were sending aid, there were lots of reasons. One reason they said was because they were afraid about the they were afraid about the spread of Bolshevism. So Red Vienna, I haven't done it yet, but we can see, is aid actually going to where there are political problems, or is it going to need? There's so many things that we can see through this. And also then will allow us to compare people who are receiving aid and who are hungry from other places. So comparison. And then finally, I think that being so precise shows respect. So instead of just saying, all these people were hungry, oh, they received aid, we can pinpoint and say, how hungry were they? Who was suffering the most? Were they male? Were they female? What was their background? Where did they live? And I think for me this is the most important point. And then we can also measure the effectiveness of aid. So if you have an organization that works with the locals immediately, how does that differ from an organization that doesn't want to? So I gave the example of Leipzig, but there are other examples that are like that. So let's see. That's the end. Thank you. Please, if you have any questions, let me know.